Okay, today we're going to be talking about the eyes and the ears, so let's start out with the eyes. Okay, the eyes are not just the eyeballs themselves, but the eyes have what we call accessory structures that help support what the eyeballs are doing, primarily through protective measures. And of course, we know we have eyebrows above the eyes, and they kind of prevent moisture or things from just being able to go from the forehead down into the eyeballs. And of course, we have what we typically call the palpebra, or the eyelids is what we typically call it. And the eyelids, of course, constantly protect the eyes. We constantly blink, and of course that causes us to release tears. But the eyelids are very protective, and we blink a lot and don't even realize it. Now, again, the name for the eyelids is the palpebra, and within the palpebra, of course, the eyelid, also called the palpebra, is very protective of the eye, and there's a protective covering within the eyelid that is called the conjunctiva, and it's a mucous membrane covered by specialized squamous epithelium. And the part of the conjunctiva that's actually next to the eyelid, we call it the palpebral conjunctiva, and the part of the conjunctiva that's actually next to the sclera of the eye, we actually call the bulbar conjunctiva. And of course, most of you have heard of conjunctivitis, an infection of this, which we also call pink eye. Now, we also have eyelashes that are affiliated with our palpebra or eyelids, and our eyelashes are very sensitive. If anything touches an eyelash, it sets off a reflex for the eyelid or palpebra to close, thus further protect the eye. So, again, the eyes need protection. They are exposed to the opening, to the outside world. So we have some lacrimal things that are affiliated with that we'll talk about in the next slide. These eyelashes that we're talking about also have their own sebaceous glands that are called glands of Zeiss. So your eyelashes, your eyebrows, your eyelids, they're all affiliated with the eye, basically to protect the eye. Continuing with our accessory structures, we have a whole group of structures that are there to keep the eye healthy by secreting tears, which is the closest thing to pure water in the body, but it does include some really important antibodies called IgA antibodies that basically keep our eyes from getting exposed and infected, because they are exposed to the outside world. So this group of tear-related structures is called our lacrimal apparatus. First of all, if we look up in the lateral corner of the eye, we see a lacrimal gland, and that's responsible for creating our tears. Coming from the lacrimal gland is the lacrimal gland ducts, or also called the excretory ducts of the lacrimal gland, and so our lacrimal gland produces the tears. They travel through the ducts in the superior lateral part of the eye. They wash across the eye to the medial side of the eye, and then there's actually some holes in the corner of our eyes called lacrimal punctums. So the tears then would go into the lacrimal punctum, and then would actually travel through a lacrimal canaliculus or canal into a lacrimal sac. And then the lacrimal sac would travel down the side of the nose in the mucous membrane areas, where there would be a nasolacrimal duct that would allow the tears that had traveled across the eyes to actually go into that mucous membrane lining. Now, if we get an overproduction of tears, like in a crying situation, then that's why our nose runs, because those tears actually build up and they go down into our nose and they make our nose run while we cry. But just every time you blink, you're going to actually get tears washing across your eyes, keeping them clean, keeping things washed out, and the excess tears that wash across the eyes, or the excess water going across the eyes, then just goes down into your mucous membrane where it's absorbed. What we're really interested in, though, is the actual structure of the eyeball, and we know that the eyeball can be divided up into 3 layers, which we also call tunics. The outside layer is called the fibrous tunic. The middle layer is called the vascular tunic, and the most inward layer that surrounds a jelly-like material that's called vitreous humor that's within a posterior cavity, that most inward layer is what we call the nervous tunic, or commonly we call it the retina. Now let's look at these different layers or tunics again, and let's try to describe the different parts. First, let's take the fibrous tunic. So the fibrous tunic is made up of mainly the white part of the eye, which is the sclera, and the sclera then attaches to the clear portion of the eye called the cornea, which is the outer clear area, the area that light has to pass through initially before it can enter into the rest of the eye. And then we have a little reabsorption area we'll talk about a little bit later, where the cornea and the sclera meet, called the canal of Schlemm. Okay, our next layer is the vascular tunic, and it's made up primarily of an area called the choroid or choroid coat. But up closer to the area where light comes in, we see a portion of the vascular tunic. It's called the ciliary body. And the ciliary body is actually where we produce aqueous humor, a fluid that actually circulates through the anterior portion of the eye. And the ciliary body is also where we have muscles that attach to ligaments called suspensory ligaments, which are also attached to our lens. Now, that ciliary body has a boundary on it where it actually meets with the rest of the choroid coat, and that's called the ora serrata. It is kind of a serrated area, and then inside that ciliary body we actually have muscles again that attach to the suspensory ligaments, because what we got to do to the lens, which is also made out of these miraculously clear proteins, is we need to change that lens by pulling it according to if we're looking at something up close or looking at something further away. We kind of take that disc shape and we change its shape to accommodate whether we're seeing something nearsighted or farsighted. Okay, we also have the opening into this portion of our eye. This opening is actually called the pupil, and that opening is found within the iris, and the iris is the colored portion of our eyes, and the iris actually has muscles on the back of it which help open up the pupil and make it either larger or smaller, and the muscles on the back of it are called either sphincter muscles, which make it smaller, or dilator muscles, which make the pupil larger. We can also see our third layer in the eye, which is our retina, which is also made up or makes up what we call the nervous tunic or the nervous layer, but it's more commonly called the retina. It's about the size of a postage stamp, and it has four major layers in it. Now, the major portions, the major layers in it, the layer that's actually up against the choroid coat is called the pigmented epithelial layer, and it actually absorbs light and reflects part of that back to the second layer, which is made up of our photoreceptors, which are made up of rods and cones. Now, rods allow us to see black and white, and cones allow us to see color. Okay, after the rods and cones, we actually have a bipolar cell. They actually are synapsing with the rods and cones photoreceptors, and the rods and cones are actually doing something kind of unique. They're releasing an inhibitory neurotransmitter, which are preventing the bipolar cell layer from actually releasing their neurotransmitter. Okay, then the third layer of cells, or I should say the fourth layer of cells, the final layer, is the ganglion cell layers. And the ganglion cell layers receive their neurotransmitters from the bipolar cells, and then they're actually neural cells, and they actually have axons, and their axons come together to actually form the optic nerve. Now, where the optic nerve leaves the back of the eye is the optic disc, and that is literally your blind spot, which is in your peripheral vision. Now, the the rods and cones again, rods again allow us to see peripheral vision in black and white and allow us to see in low light conditions. The cones, however, allow us to see in color and also allow us to see in detail. So when you can focus in on something, you're actually using your cones, but you do require a certain amount of light for that to happen. So we have a general region called the macula lutea, and the macula lutea is mostly cones, even though there are some rods. The fovea, though, is the center of that, and that's our highest concentration of cones. Therefore, it gives us our most detailed vision. And so sometimes if people have a degeneration of those cones, they will get macular degenerative disease, and they'll be able to see general shapes, but they won't be able to see too much detail. Okay, now, here again we can see our 4 layers. We can see our pigmented epithelium, which is up against our choroid coat, and that's the light actually bypasses the neural cells until it hits the pigmented cells and reflects back off the pigmented epithelial cells. We do see our rods and cones, again, rods being responsible for low light ability to see, and also we see our peripheral vision mainly with our rods. Our cones make more of a one-to-one contact, so we see detailed vision from our cones. They actually have pigments in them that allow us to see colors and combine those colors for more of a visual pattern. And we also see, again, our bipolar cells, the cells that connect the photoreceptors to our ganglion cells. We see our ganglion cells, and we see the axons again coming together to form our optic nerve. Here again we can see where all those axons from that last neuron section of our retina, the ganglion cells, are coming together to form our optic nerve, but we also see our optic disc, and since there's no photoreceptors in this area, then this does literally form a blind spot. Our brain fills in what it thinks should be there in our peripheral vision, but there is a literal blind spot in that area. Okay, so here we see the 2 big chambers in the eye, or 2 big cavities, I should say, in the eye. The anterior cavity, which is divided into an anterior chamber and a posterior chamber, and the posterior cavity, which is divided into the vitreous chamber. Now, the anterior cavity, the anterior chamber, is actually in front of the iris but behind the cornea, and it is filled up with aqueous humor. The posterior chamber is behind the iris but in front of the vitreous chamber, and this is includes where the ciliary body is. Now, the ciliary body is producing this aqueous fluid called aqueous humor, this watery type fluid, and you can see in the picture where it circulates from the ciliary body up through the pupil and into the anterior chamber. Now, if we're constantly making this fluid, we've also got to reabsorb some of it so we don't put too much pressure and damage everything by creating but not reabsorbing. So that's where the canal of Schlemm comes in, and that's that little hole there, which is basically where the cornea and the sclera meet. That's where we're going to reabsorb the aqueous humor back into the blood so we can continue to circulate it. And of course, this controls the pressure on the eye. The aqueous humor and the vitreous humor both are partly responsible for the shape of the eye, and of course, if you don't reabsorb the aqueous humor properly, then that could damage the parts of the eye, cause blindness. That's basically what glaucoma is, and that's also why when you go to the eye doctor and they blow that air into your eye, they're testing the pressure of it to make sure you're reabsorbing your aqueous humor okay. Now, in the posterior chamber of the eye, or posterior cavity in the posterior chamber, what we actually have is we have a jelly-like material that's actually pressing against the retina and pressing the retina up against the choroid coat. This helps form part of the shape of our eye. It's a jelly-like material that's actually called vitreous humor. And so this is pushing up against that. It's a kind of also a clear type fluid, so our light is passing through our cornea, through the aqueous humor, through the pupil, through the lens, and through this vitreous humor until it projects itself back on the fovea at the rear part of that, where we get our most detailed vision. Now,